My topic is how time flies. So I'm going to talk about velocity and subjectivity of temporal flow. So I have to make it clear at the outstart that this will be very metaphysical, but I would try to prove that there's some practical use. So let's start. Okay, does not work. Okay, I assume that many of you are familiar with the debate between A and B theories of time. The A theory would say time has three dimensions, namely past, future, and present. And because of these, time flows insofar as each dimension has an individually different content at every moment. But B theory argues, no, that does not work. We only have two dimensions in time, earlier and later. Why, for instance, in theory of relativity, to synchronize periodical processes at different locations, such as the rotation of clock will become synchronized if the speed and gravity at these two locations differ. Hence, B theory will say time does not flow. There are two considerations essential for this debate. One is the velocity of temporal flow, which is raised by C.D. Broad. He said, well, if you want to talk about the stream of consciousness, you want to talk about the temporal flow, then you have to define the velocity, the rate at which time flows. Otherwise, that does not make sense. But if we try to talk about the velocity of temporal flow, then we have difficulties. Namely, how can we measure the velocity of temporal flows against another time? Then we will fall into infinite regress. And if we say that time flows 1 second per second, then this is a very trivial answer. It does not convey any information about the speed of time. The reason behind all this observation is that the rate of temporal flow is very different from the rate of a spatial change, because like a physical process, it can continue and stop. But if time flows, it flows relentlessly. It flows all the way along. So rate has a very different meaning in the context of temporal flows than in motion of quantitative change. And it is wrong to say the passage of time is something that takes place in time. To conclude, temporal velocity requires a positive and metaphysically interesting definition, analogous to yet different from the rate of motion of qualitative change. This does not mean that we can always measure the velocity of time. I don't have enough time to go very deep into this part, but I would say the second consideration for this debate is the subject's contribution to temporal flow. Namely, we feel that we are at the 0 point of time. We are at the present. We have such an impression. So the subjects seem to contribute to a flowing time. But we need to avoid two dispositions in this debate. Namely, one is to be language obsessed and say, this is just a matter of language expression, has nothing to do with our experience. And the second is to say, well, if the subject contributes to temporal flow, then temporal flow is an illusion. I would say this is a too hasty conclusion, because subject is a term with multiple senses. We have to first determine what the relevant sense of subject for the subjective contribution to temporal flow, and then we can determine whether this subjective contribution threatens the objectivity of temporal flow. Now, so to conclude, we need to answer the following question. When does the time flow? Or which types of time flow and which do not? If a particular type of time flows, how should we define the velocity of temporal flow? In which sense does the subject contribute to temporal flows? And if we wish to distinguish between different types of strata of time, how should we explain the fact that a perceptual object and a perceptual experience seem to be simultaneous? Now, let's start with Husserl. Husserl will say, if you distinguish between physical time and experiential time, then this distinction is too coarse-grained. We need more precise distinctions. And he divides experiential time into original process and phenomenological time. And what is original process? For instance, now I am in a current experiential state. This experiential state is going away from the past experiential state and towards the future experiential state. In other words, this is retention and protension directed at the entire past and future experiential states, not just at their primal impressions. And what is the phenomenological time? And as pointed out by the previous talk by Kwok, the relationship is in fact the relationship between original process and phenomenological time is in fact analogous to the one between visual perception and its object, although it is not identical. For instance, I may have an experience of giving a talk now. Then perhaps 20 minutes later, I have the identical experience in my retention. Now, through these various experiential states, we identify with a constancy, this identical experience, and this is the phenomenological charm. And hence, this relationship is just like the one between various visual perception and a visual object. Now, as for physical charm, Husserl distinguishes physical charm into environmental charm and idealized charm. What is environmental charm, and why is it different from the phenomenological charm? Husserl will say, well, in the environmental charm, we have different repetitive processes, like the rotation of clock hand. So these repetitive processes are existentially independent of whether a subject perceives it or not. Whether you perceive the rotation of clock, no, I perceive it, does not matter, the clock just rotates. Hence, we can say that the environmental charm can be subject to certain measures by the periodical processes. This endows it with a particular topological structure, which does not apply to phenomenological charm. Now, what is the idealized charm? To understand the idealized charm, we have to first understand the intersubjective environmental charm. How should we go from the individual environmental charm to intersubjective environmental charm? According to Husserl, it goes in the following way. Suppose that you and I both agree on the identity of temporal units, namely certain periodical processes like a rotation of clock hands in terms of seconds, minutes, and hours, and we also agree on the initial point of measurement, such as the Greenwich charm, the birth of Christ. Then we can say this environmental charm not just belongs to you and me, it belongs to each of us. And this is an intersubjective environmental charm. An idealized charm is obtained by applying these procedures to infinity. Now, we have different possibilities of idealization. One is the Newtonian physical charm, which can be taken as a special case of the environmental charm. Namely, we have a global, well-defined presence. By contrast, in relativity theory, different dwellers in different locations do not generally agree on the identity of temporal units, since those repetitive processes repeat themselves at different rates. Hence, we can say we have 4 strata of temporality: the original process, the physical, phenomenological charm, the environmental charm, and the idealized charm. Each high-level charm is the constancy identified through variations on the lower level. And according to Husserl, the former 3 has that 3 dimension and a task flowing. But this claim is not justified until we have defined the velocity of temporality and explained what the subjective contribution to temporal flow is. Now, let's define temporal velocity. Here, I will rely on Herbart, who is famous and infamous for mathematicizing the mind. Why is it legitimate to apply mathematics to experiences? You say this is crazy. Herbart would say, well, if you talk about a stronger or weaker emotion, then mental phenomena are thoroughly mathematical. The problem is not whether you should apply mathematics, but what kind of mathematics applies to mental phenomena. And you can also say it can be alleged that mind cannot be measured, but this is not an argument against the application of mathematics, since it's possible to operate with mental entities without fully determining their value. Just like you can discuss the relationship between between the roots of this equation without solving this equation. Now, for my discussions, it is important to note that Herbart offered 2 determining factors of the mind. One is the strength of each mental power, and the other is the degree of oppositions between different powers, and this will be crucial for my definition of temporal velocity. Now, to understand Herbart, you have to first understand Fichte. So Fichte established such a model. He said, what is absolute self? Absolute self is striving, and striving confronts the resistance. The resistance is taken to be inertia. Now, it means that the striving suffers from a reduced quantity of activity, and how much the striving suffers, then how strong is the resistance? An equal quantity of activity to the sublating one lies in the resistance. Now, Herbert reforms Fischer's system by replacing the relationship between absolute self and inertia with the relationship between different mental powers. Suppose that we have two mental powers competing with each other. Now, each mental power necessarily suffers from the power that is striving against it. And according to Fischer, it means that the reduced strength of each opposing power will be the same. We can put it in mathematical terms. We say that we have two mental powers, I and J, and we denote their strengths as Pi and Pj, and the degree of opposition between them is Mij. Then we can say the strength of I reduced by J is Mij Pj. The same goes with the strength of I reduced by J reduced by I. Now, if we have three mental powers, I, J, K, then we can denote the remaining strengths of Pi as Ri equals Pi minus Mijpj, Mikpk, which means that now I have a mental power I. Now this mental power suffers from the opposition from K and J. Why is this Ri important? Because when Ri equals 0, then this strength PR is termed as the threshold of consciousness. It means that if mental power is below the threshold of consciousness, that it does not manifest. It's not conscious. If it is above it, then it manifests. Now, I define the velocity of the original process in the following way. V equals the summation of all Pi for I that satisfy Ri larger than 0, which means that for all mental powers that is above the threshold of consciousness, we sum up their strengths, and this, I would say, is the velocity of the original process. Why is it decay? Why should we define temporal velocity in such a manner? Let's see. First of all, this definition does not refer to a meta-temporality against which one measures the velocity of a given time. Rather, it consists in the felt contrast between the manifested powers in a given moment. Namely, if I feel that at this moment there are more mental powers manifested, more mental powers above the threshold of consciousness, then the temporal velocity is bigger. And we do not have to refer to a meta time. We just have to feel the contrast between this state and previous states. Moreover, this approach is metaphysically interesting because it tells us what temporal velocity is in comparison with 1 second per second, which is very trivial. It does not tell us what temporal velocity is. Second, this definition is conceptually comparable to yet different from the rate of motion of qualitative change. Namely, we usually define the velocity of a physical process as the distance traveled in a given period of time. Now, we have indeed a distance between a power and its manifestation. And this distance is covered when the power manifests, when the power is above the threshold of consciousness. But this distance is not temporal or spatial distance, it's a conceptual distance. Finally, regarding the velocity of the original process, I can offer two predictions which can be confirmed by psychological evidence. First, if the strength of all mental powers in general increases while the degree of opposition between them remain relatively constant, then the speed of the original process will increase. Namely, we can see the following formula. The strength of mental power increases means Pi or increases, while Mij remain constant. This means the mental power to satisfy Ri larger than 0 would be constant, whereas the summation of Pi will become larger because Pi in general become larger. The second prediction is that if the degree of opposition increases, whereas the strength of each power remain constant, then the velocity of the original process will reduce. Look at this formula again. It means that if Mij increases while Pij remain constant, then Ri will become smaller. Hence, those I's that satisfy Ri larger than 0 will be fewer, and namely the mental powers that is above the stretch of consciousness would become fewer, and the summation of them would also become smaller. Now, we have psychological evidence for this, in just pointed out by the previous talk by Professor Wittmann. The first prediction, it means that if you are more excited, if your arousal level is higher, then you will feel a faster temporal flow. This is confirmed by psychological evidence. Like in mania, you will indeed experience a faster temporal flow, whereas in depression, the temporal flow is slower. As for the second prediction, it means that if you are thrown into an unfamiliar situation, a conflict situation, where the degree of opposition between different mental powers become larger, then you will experience a slowdown effect of temporal velocity. As pointed out by previous talk, during COVID-19 pandemic, at the start, not at the end, at the start, we will feel that time seems to slow down, and maybe we can explain why. Because at the start, we are thrown into an unfamiliar situation. We perhaps want to obey our routines. We want to go to a restaurant. We want to drive to work, but suddenly all these are forbidden. So we're in a conflict situation. Also, a similar case is car accident. Is an unfamiliar situation, and the temporal velocity will slow down. By contrast, we can observe a reduced degree of opposition and an increased velocity of experiential time during flow stage, where we can say the single task monopolizes the subject's power, such that we have an ultra-stable situation. The conflict is reduced to a very small degree. Like the surgeon can perform an operation for 5 hours without thirsty or hungry. And in this case, the subject will feel timelessness because the time flows so fast. Now, I wish to extend this definition to a higher strata of temporality, like the environmental temporality. Why does my definition also apply to environmental temporality? We have in the environment certain periodical processes which repeat themselves, like the rotation of clock hand. Now, these periodical processes depends on the manifestation of different powers, like the clock spring is fastened, the air friction is not too high, and so on. The fact that these processes repeat themselves indicate that the total amount of power manifested in such processes are relatively constant. These, hence, our above definition of temporal velocity, V equals the summation of all pi where ijk are the powers that manifest themselves in these repetitive processes also apply. This is in fact a kind of inertia law. Inertia law means that a motion would continue uniformly if no further force is exerted on it or subtracted from it. Now, the second last thing I wish to say here is that we should not take the problem of experiential temporal velocity as a comparison between the subject's internal time and a representation of external time. Why shouldn't we do that? For instance, we would say that this day feels like a year for me. Now, if we do this comparison, if we measure the experiential temporality with periodical process in the physical environment, then we would say this day, this is the measurement. But if this is the whole story, we will not continue to say it feels like a year for me. It feels like a year for me is the manner how we convey a privately felt or perceived experiential temporality to other subjects. And if this is true, it means that the felt or perceived temporality is original, whereas the comparison between experiential time and physical time is derivative. Now, I have no time to go through all these parts. I would just point out three essential conclusions. One, what is the relevant subject for subjective contribution to temporality? I would say it's neither transcendental subjectivity nor the psychological subject. Rather, it is the ultimate principle of individuation, according to Husserl. And how does it contribute to temporality? I would say neither power manifestation nor the subject per se are temporal. Rather, it is an interlock between power manifestation and the subject that give rise to time. And finally, I wish to point out one thing. present is often regarded in current debate as a monadic property of temporal entities, such as the redness and shape, or as the direct relations between events. As for me, I would say both are not precise. I would rather define present as a quadratic relations between a power, a manifestation, and the subjects relative to whom they are individualized. So it means present means that a power is actually manifesting. So a power and its manifestation individualized relative to the same subject. So that is a whole my talk. I'm looking forward to your feedback. Thank you.